All right, here we go. Let's talk about during reading strategies. And we're going to focus on this video on some of the value of these strategies, as well as some examples of strategies. The great thing about during reading strategies is they tend to be things that work in multiple contexts. So you don't always have to do a lot of personalization to the thing that you're reading. Just need to choose one that makes sense and have it ready to pull out. So during reading strategies, we've talked about before reading strategies already. Those help students' brains sort of turn on to what they're about to read. So they activate prior knowledge, they preview complex vocabulary. One key goal of a before reading strategy is to increase their buy-in to the reading, so get them excited or interested or curious in what they're about to read, and also set the purpose for reading. So we're going to read this because we're going to continue thinking about this type of thing. A during reading strategy, then, the goal of any during reading strategy is to help students read actively as opposed to passively. So you'll have a lot of students in your class who we would call passive readers instead of active readers. We'll talk about what that means on the next few slides. But the during reading strategy's job is to help students gain the skills of engaged and active reading, because we may be naturally active readers, right? A lot of aspiring English teachers, English people, we read books, we're into them, we're excited about them. We read textbooks, we're curious about learning, right? We're excited about these types of things. There are things, right? That's a part of who we are as people who love English. Often, right? Not every English teacher is necessarily a skillful reader, and that's okay too. But a lot of times for us, we're really into reading, and so we tend to read in very engaged ways. But that's not necessarily true for all your students, right? Not all of your students see reading as a cool hobby to have, and maybe that's okay, but we do want them to have the skills of engaged and active reading. So active reading means while you're reading, you're making connections, you're monitoring your own comprehension, you're looking for places you're getting confused and then doing something about that as you're reading. You're generating questions, maybe you're questioning the text, maybe you're getting curious about other things, and they help us stay focused. So that's a huge important goal, not only for the general population of readers in your classroom, because that's really important too, but students with learning disabilities, right? Like, during reading strategies are really valuable for everybody, especially valuable for anybody who we would call like a struggling reader, okay? So there are three key types of during reading strategies: graphic organizers, annotation strategies, and note-taking. And we'll talk about some examples of each of these as we go. So here's a little more information about sort of passive versus active readers. One thing I want to clarify on this is some people, there's no such thing as a person who only ever passively reads and a person who only ever actively reads. So I don't really like types of readers. It's just sort of contextual, right? You might be a very active reader, but when you're reading like a social studies textbook, you tend to be more passive because you're just less engaged, you understand less or whatever. So we don't want to like pigeonhole people like, oh, this person's only a passive reader, right? It depends on whether they are interested in and engaged in the text and whether they already have been taught or are pre-talented in those skills of active reading. So we cannot assume that students are actively reading. We have to teach them how to actively read. And that's the value of making these strategies explicit and incorporating them consistently in our classrooms. Okay? So a passive reader is getting by. They may be even fake reading, like Tavani sort of talked about, but they can't always remember what they read. They could pronounce all the words, they could read it out loud and still not really comprehend. So we have to work on comprehension strategies for those students. Whereas an active reader, they're going to be engaged as they're reading. They're going to be making personal connections. They're going to feel empathy for the characters. They're going to make connections to what they already know. They're going to make predictions. They may even question the text or sort of critique some of the author's arguments or the evidence that they're using. They're going to make inferences. So if something is unclear, they're going to say, ooh, I think the writer's probably trying to suggest this. They may be looking for metaphors if it's a literary text on their own, but we need to support them in teaching them how to use these active reading strategies. So here's what an active mind might look like while they're reading. And probably as you are reading most things, these might seem natural to us again, but the majority of our students need to be taught these things, or at least have these things consistently reinforced to support their reading comprehension and their overall literacy. So this is from an Edutopia article. Edutopia is a great organization to follow. On YouTube, they have a blog, etc. But active reading, one of the key things is to make sure you help students set a purpose for reading. So anytime you ask students to read a text, and I want to clarify too, this means if you play a YouTube video, if you have them watch a movie, if you watch a TED Talk, so any type of text that they are interacting with or reading in quotation marks, right? If you give them a painting to look at and you're asking them to analyze it, you always tell them what you want them to get out of it before they read the text, before they watch the film, before they analyze the video. You always help them set that purpose, okay? So it confronts the passive reading approach by just handing them the text and saying, okay, read this. But you want to say, we're looking at this painting and I want you to look for the use of color. Same thing if you're reading a text. We're reading this text. Edgar Allan Poe does a great job of creating atmosphere. I want you to look for lines that help build that atmosphere. And then when we're done, we're going to talk about those lines, right? So there's a little bit of something's at stake, right? They know what you're going to talk about afterwards. They know that they're looking for it. And that's going to help guide their reading and create that focus and that sense of reading with a purpose. Now, I want to mention too, sometimes it's good to help students set their own purposes for reading. We don't want them to be little robots who only look for what we're looking for. So you might say, I want you to look for any cool moments that create atmosphere because we're going to talk about that. I also want you to annotate anything else that stands out to you, anything else you have a question about. So giving them a little bit of freedom as well and independence in choosing what's important in the reading, it's also really powerful, right? We don't always want to tell them the thing that they're looking for. So if you're using a text to talk about metaphors, you want to say, hey, we're going to look for metaphors in this. Here's a graphic organizer to help you do that. Or we're going to annotate where we see metaphors. Or here's a little note-taking system we're going to use to think about these metaphors. Or we're going to look for really tough vocabulary. I want you to use this chart to jot down any words that are difficult for you. So active reading should be key in every or almost every reading task you give students. Okay? So graphic organizers, annotation strategies, and note-taking. I'll show you some examples. We'll think about some of these. Here's an example here of like a story map, okay? So this is something that if you were reading fictional stories, if you were reading a unit on short stories, something like that, right? Just having students jot down these things as they read can help them process and think. So I really like this one, especially important events. So having students just track the key things that happen in the text can be surprisingly powerful because that's going to give you something to discuss later. That's going to help them track main ideas. So a lot of my favorite graphic organizers are just like what happens in this story. Especially valuable if it's a difficult to understand story. Students can often get the main things that happen even if they don't understand all of the flowery language or all of the metaphors, right? Just what happens in this story. We're going to start there because that's the first step to comprehension. Outcome, maybe you have them reflect on theme as they read as well. So you have this link posted on Classroom, and I want to show you here in my Drive folder. These are all examples of graphic organizers that I have created or used in my own high school teaching experience. All of them worked pretty well. So some of these were provided by the textbook. Like this one, we read Coyote and the Buffalo in American Lit, a Native American trickster tale. And the textbook provided this as one of its resources. I thought it was great. Coyote does this, what do I predict will happen, right? It's a fairly easy to comprehend story. So I wanted them to think beyond just what is happening and make some types of predictions based on what we know about trickster tales, right? So they're activating a little bit of knowledge there. This one was also provided by the textbook company, and we were talking about the characteristics of a creation story. So it describes how the world began. So as you read, what details do we get about how the world began? To guide people, what details do we get that would help guide people if you were hearing this tale as part of your oral tradition, right? So provided by the textbook company are great often. Some of these I created. So we had a unit on Victorian literature, and a lot of them talk about women's roles. So we use this unit to talk about how women's roles have changed and not changed in society since then, since the Victorian American era. So we read an article about the ideal of true womanhood at the time: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. And then as they read, I wanted them to look for clues from the text that the woman was expected to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. And then over here, a little bit of reflection. So you can take a closer look at these as we go. We read Equiano, the slave narrative, and we talked about how he uses sensory details to create empathy in the reader to convince them that slavery was morally incorrect. And so I asked students to note lines in which he's using those senses to describe the experience of being on a slave ship. I included this graphic in the background just to give them a little bit more context and background information. Here are some, you can take a look at some of these other ones here, but here's just a general one that I found online and just printed out hundreds of copies of in my classroom, just pulled out whenever I needed a graphic organizer for active reading. It's a timeline. So students just know what happens first, what happens next, what happens then, right? Even this simple type of thing is going to help students read more actively. You could turn it into activity afterwards. What did you include? What did you not include? Why did you think that is important? Why did you think that was not important enough to include on the timeline, right? So there's a little bit of higher order thinking that can be added to these after you focus on, like, did you pick up on the key ideas that happened? So those are available for you to peruse as necessary, as needed. But the key idea is it's really simple to make a chart with, like, what do you want them to look for, and then give them a space to jot down when they find that thing. And that's sort of my go-to graphic organizer strategy. Also on Classroom, I want to show you two. Let's get to the right class here. You have several other links to help you explore some of these during reading strategies. Let me get to the right week. Here we go. During reading resources. So here's the link to the graphic organizer folder. Here's just a quick video on some reading strategies that research shows might be a little less effective or outdated, just so that you don't choose those for reading strategies. Here's another one too, another quick video about some of the key things good readers do. We use that phrase a lot, like good readers visualize as they read. So it's going to talk you through some of those, and that can help you choose good strategies too. So for example, visualize. You might have students draw a picture of these key ideas as they're reading, or turn it into sort of a graphic novel page as they're reading with little stick figures. Something like that can be really cool too. You can give students the option. Here's the graphic novel page, here's the timeline. What works best for you? And that can be powerful as well. So take a look at that. It doesn't give specific strategies necessarily, but it helps you understand some of the key things that a good engaged reader will be doing. A couple links here too. This just is a PDF with a lot of before, during, and after. Some of them, it's sort of out of order. So some of these, like this is prior knowledge, this is going to be before. So as you read it, just make sure it's something you would have students do while they are reading the text. And then I linked this PDF again. It's coming back into our lives for each part of the process because it's that good. So you can scroll down to the during, after, read what it says about during strategies, read what it says about the during strategies, how to plan them, the purposes for them, using mental imagery, integrating new information, monitoring your comprehension, right? Things to consider when you choose one. So if the text structure is going to be challenging, a graphic organizer with, part 1, part 2, part 3 might be really helpful. If the text is going to be challenging to comprehend, you might want to do some chunking with some pausing in there, monitoring their comprehension. And then there's several during strategies as well here. So coding the text can be cool. 3, 2, 1 is really cool. So you can scroll through these as you're thinking. Again, just make sure you choose something that is during reading. So some of these are sort of after as well. So you want to choose something that students would be doing while they are reading. Okay. So there are the resources that you have for during reading, and your job for this week is just to find a few that you can see yourself using and add them to a during reading strategy Foursquare. And then you're going to choose one eventually to use for your the same little practice text that you chose for the before reading strategy. Let me know if you have any questions, and I can't wait to see what you come up with. Bye.